April 6, 1945, Merkers, Germany, a small mining town near the Thuringian border that almost nobody had heard of. The war was 3 weeks from ending. American forces were moving so fast across Germany that supply lines could barely keep up. Entire German divisions were surrendering by the hour. Towns that had been defended to the last man just weeks earlier were now raising white flags before the first American Jeep rolled into view. General George S. Patton had seen a lot in this war. Normandy beaches, the hedgerows of France, the bloodbath at the Bulge. He had stood on the edges of history more times than any man should. But nothing in his 40 years of soldiering had prepared him for what waited 2,000 feet beneath the earth in a German salt mine. Not a weapons cache, not a hidden army. Something stranger. Something that made Patton, one of the most unflappable men in the United States Army, stop dead in his tracks and call it ugly. It started, like most impossible things, with a rumor. On April 4, 1945, 2 French displaced workers, men who had been forced into German labor, approached an MP checkpoint near Merkers. They were nervous, looking over their shoulders, speaking fast. The MP on duty called for a translator. Private First Class Mac Dean from Louisville, Kentucky, 23 years old, fluent in French from his mother's side. The workers said they had seen something. Before being put to work in the salt mines, they had been in the tunnels, the Kaiserode mine, deep shafts that stretched miles underground. Germans had been bringing things down, big things, crates and boxes and sacks. Lots of soldiers guarding them, not just guards, but SS. Dean wrote it up and sent it up the chain. Within 48 hours, a unit from the 90th Infantry Division had secured the mine entrance. The Germans who had been guarding it had fled. The shaft elevator still worked, but no one knew what was inside. Colonel Bernard Bernstein, the chief financial officer of the Allied forces and a man whose job was to track stolen Nazi assets, was called in. He had been following leads about Nazi treasure movements for months, gold reserves, currency, artwork. The trails kept going cold, but this one felt different. On April 6th, Bernstein descended into the mine. What he found in Chamber 8 stopped him so completely that he stood in the entrance for almost a full minute without speaking, just looking. He radioed up, his exact words recorded by the duty operator. "Get me Patton. Get me Patton right now." Before we go any further, and trust me, you are not ready for what's in that mine, make sure you hit subscribe. We tell the stories they don't teach in school. Hit that button so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back underground. Chamber 8 was a cavern the size of a cathedral, carved from salt that was 250 million years old. The walls were pale white and gray, crystalline, almost beautiful. The air was cold and dry, 50 degrees year-round, which was one reason the Germans had chosen this place. Things stored in salt mines don't rot, don't rust, don't deteriorate. That was by design. Stacked from floor to ceiling, stretching back into the darkness further than Bernstein's flashlight could reach, were the assets of the German Reich. The gold came first, 250 tons of it, in bars, in sacks, in boxes, stamped with the Reichsbank eagle. Each bar weighing approximately 27 pounds. The total value in 1945 dollars, $238 million. In today's money, closer to $4 billion. But the gold was just the beginning. Paper currency from every occupied country, French francs, Belgian francs, Norwegian kroner, Polish zloty. Thousands of paper bags, each one packed tight. The Nazis had stripped the central banks of every nation they conquered and brought the reserves here. Then the suitcases, thousands of them, ordinary luggage, leather, cloth, cardboard, stacked in rows that went on for 100 feet. Bernstein's soldiers opened one. Inside, rings, watches, necklaces, fillings, dental gold pulled from human mouths. A notation card listed where the bag had come from, one of the camps, one of the death factories. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then there was the art. Paintings, hundreds of them wrapped in oilskin, leaned against the salt walls. Sculptures, religious artifacts, ancient manuscripts in glass cases, tapestries rolled in muslin, the greatest private art collection in history, assembled by theft. But the last chamber, the one in the deepest section of the mine, behind a steel door, locked with two separate mechanisms, that's the one that had Bernstein call for Patton specifically. That chamber contained something different, something personal. Bernstein had it noted in his field report simply as items believed to be from the private collection of Adolf Hitler, personally acquired and personally stored. Status: extraordinary. He didn't want to be the one to decide what happened to them. He needed a general. He needed someone with authority, and frankly, someone with nerve. He needed Patton. Patton arrived at Merkers on April 12, 1945. He did not come alone. Generals Eisenhower and Omar Bradley were with him, the three men who more than anyone else had orchestrated the liberation of Western Europe, together at a salt mine elevator shaft in central Germany. The elevator was industrial, built from miners. It had no walls, just a metal cage, a grated floor, a single bare bulb overhead. Eisenhower joked before they descended that if the cable broke, the war's command structure would be decapitated in one moment. Nobody laughed very hard. The descent took 4 minutes, 2,000 feet. The temperature dropped as they went down, their breath fogged. The light changed from the gray of an April sky to the pale electric glow of work lamps strung along the shaft. Private First Class Raymond Sears, a 20-year-old from Alabama, serving as part of the mine security detail, was there when the generals stepped out of the elevator. He later gave an interview to the Stars and Stripes Army newspaper. They came off that elevator and you could see all three of them just stop and look. Not shocked, not scared, just stopped, like they were trying to understand what their eyes were telling them. Bernstein led them through the chambers in order, the gold first. Eisenhower walked the rows slowly, doing the math in his head. Bradley counted bar stacks. Patton walked ahead, moving faster, not lingering. He went through the currency room, looked at the suitcases from the camps, jaw tight, didn't stop. Through the art galleries of looted masterworks, barely glancing left or right. He was heading for the last chamber. Bernstein had to move quickly to keep up with him. "General, that's what I wanted you to see specifically." "Open it," Patton said. Bernstein unlocked the steel door. It swung open on heavy hinges. The cold air inside was even drier than the outer chambers. The work lamp was dimmer here. It took a moment for eyes to adjust. What Patton saw was this: a long room, perhaps 60 feet deep, 20 wide. On the left wall, stacked in wooden crates, were silver pieces. Not bars, not currency. Objects, plates, candelabras, serving trays, silverware in velvet cases, decorative urns, picture frames, a set of serving bowls so large a man could bathe in. On the right wall, behind glass, were items that looked almost like museum pieces. Documents, framed and mounted, medals, personal effects, items that had clearly been chosen by someone with particular taste or particular obsession. And at the far end of the room, on a low wooden table, was the piece that had made even the stoic Bernstein go quiet. A dinner service, complete, sterling silver, hand-engraved, each piece bearing the same monogram in Gothic script, A.H. Adolf Hitler's personal silver dinner table service, his dinner plates, his soup turens, his dessert forks, the cutlery he had used at dinner parties while deciding the fate of nations. Patton walked to it. He picked up one of the forks, turned it over in his hand, examined the monogram. Then he put it down and said, loudly, clearly, so everyone in that chamber could hear, "That is the ugliest silverware I have ever seen in my life." Patton is standing in Hitler's private vault, holding the Führer's personal dinner fork, and his first reaction is to call it ugly. That's who this man was. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We put out a new story every week, moments of history that actually happened, stranger than anything Hollywood could write. Subscribe and drop in the comments, what do you think Patton should have done with it all?
The silverware was not simply ugly by civilian standards. Patton understood objects well. He came from old money, California gentry, a man who'd grown up with fine things and understood craftsmanship. What he was looking at was technically fine craftsmanship, but in the service of something grotesque. The Augsburg silver, as it would later be documented, had been crafted in the late 19th century, originally belonging to a Bavarian noble family named von Hausberg. The family was Jewish. In 1938, following Kristallnacht, their estate was seized. The silver was inventoried by the SS Cultural Property Task Force and transferred to state storage. From there, it had made its way, through a series of bureaucratic reassignments too complex to trace quickly, into Hitler's personal collection. He had it engraved with his own initials. He had used it at Berchtesgaden, his mountain retreat, at formal dinners for foreign dignitaries. Hermann Goering had eaten from those plates. Mussolini had lifted one of those wine goblets. And the von Hausberg family. Friedrich von Hausberg, 72 years old in 1938, had been arrested 2 months after his property was seized. His wife, Martha, 68, had been deported in 1942. Their son, Heinrich, had managed to flee to Switzerland in 1939. Their daughter, Elsa, had not. None of this was known in April 1945, standing in the mine. The silver was documented simply as Hitler's personal property. The full history would take investigators years to unravel. But Patton, in calling it ugly, had intuited something real. The silver was wrong. Technically fine, morally repulsive. A beautiful object used to decorate atrocity. Eisenhower ordered everything in the mine photographed, catalogued, and secured. He had an instinct, correct as it turned out, that what they were looking at was not just treasure, but evidence. Evidence of theft on a civilizational scale. Evidence of who the Nazis were and what they had done with the wealth they stripped from their victims. Patton stood in the last chamber for a few more minutes. He looked at the gold rooms, at the suitcases, at Hitler's dinner service. Then he said something that Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Howard, his aide-de-camp, wrote down that evening in his personal diary. He said, "Every piece in here is stolen. Every piece. From dead people, from living people, from countries, from families. We didn't liberate a mine. We liberated a crime scene." We are halfway through this story and it keeps getting heavier. Patton just said something that will stay with you. We didn't liberate a mine. We liberated a crime scene. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting us, share it right now. Someone you know needs to hear this. And subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this story, because what happened to all of this treasure is just as extraordinary as finding it. Keep watching. The first problem was security. Merkers was in territory that, under the Yalta Agreement, would become part of the Soviet occupation zone after the war. That was weeks away, but Eisenhower understood what it meant. If the mine was still there when the Soviets arrived, the contents would be gone. Into Moscow, into Stalin's vaults, never to be returned. The second problem was practical. 250 tons of gold does not move easily. The mine's elevator could carry 2 tons per trip. The shaft could run perhaps 20 trips per day. Moving the gold alone would take 6 days of continuous operation. And the elevator was old. German-built, maintained by the mine company, and not, as Eisenhower pointedly noted, designed for American generals to ride to their deaths. The third problem was human. Word of the discovery had spread. Not publicly, not yet. The army controlled that. But among the soldiers stationed in the area, rumors were flying. 250 tons of gold, Hitler's personal collection, the greatest treasure haul since Napoleon. Private James Kowalski from Chicago, 21 years old, part of the security detail, later told his son about it. His son gave a recorded interview in 2003 for a Veterans History project. Dad said the hardest part wasn't guarding the mine from the outside. It was guarding it from the inside, from themselves, from the guys who were thinking, no one would ever know. 1 gold bar, 1 ring, 1 painting. Who's gonna notice? Kowalski said his father saw 2 men from his unit pocket items. Small things, a coin, a brooch. The sergeant caught them within an hour. Both were reduced in rank and transferred out. The message was clear and immediate. Dad said Patton himself walked through the security detail the night before the removal began. Didn't say a lot, just looked every man in the eye, one by one, slowly. Dad said that look made you understand that whatever you were thinking about doing, you were done thinking about it. The removal operation began on April 14, 1945. It ran for 8 days, continuous, around the clock. 248 tons of gold, 3 million pieces of paper currency from 11 countries, 8,000 pieces of art, religious artifacts, and cultural treasures, Hitler's personal effects, including the silver. All of it moved to the Reichsbank building in Frankfurt, placed under Allied control. All of it, except for the suitcases from the camps. Those were kept in a separate facility, separately catalogued, for a different kind of accounting. The fate of Hitler's personal silver was not decided quickly. After the war, it sat in the Munich Central Collecting Point, a facility the Americans set up specifically to process looted art and property for almost 2 years. In 1947, investigators from the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization began the process of tracing ownership. The silver's engravings, the monogram, complicated things. Legally, property that had been personally used by a head of state existed in an ambiguous category. Some in the American government wanted it kept as evidence for the Nuremberg trials. Others wanted it destroyed as a symbolic gesture, melt it down, erase the monogram, remove it from history. The argument for melting won briefly. An order was actually issued. Then it was reversed, because investigators had traced the silver's origin, the von Hausberg family. Heinrich von Hausberg, the son who had fled to Switzerland in 1939, was alive. He was 51 years old, living in Zurich, working as a watchmaker. When investigators contacted him, he traveled to Munich to identify the collection. He walked through the catalogued items slowly. He recognized piece after piece. The large serving bowl with the floral pattern his mother had used for holidays. The dessert forks with the small twist in the handle, a defect from the silversmith. His father had always joked about it. The wine goblets, 6 of them, that had been a wedding gift to his parents. The monogram had been engraved over the original family crest. A jeweler examined it. The original crest was still there underneath if you knew where to look. Heinrich stood in the Munich collecting point for a long time. When he came out, he told the investigator assigned to his case, a young American named Arthur Goldberg, 28 years old, from New York, that he didn't want most of it back. The pieces that Hitler had used were poisoned, he said, tainted. He couldn't bring himself to eat from a plate that had been on Hitler's table. But some pieces he did want. The wedding goblets, the dessert forks with the twisted handles, objects his father had touched before it all went wrong. Those were returned to him in September 1947. Heinrich held the wedding goblet, his parents' wedding goblet, and wept. Heinrich von Hausberg holding his parents' wedding goblet in 1947. Think about that for a second. This is what restitution looks like. Not a policy, not a meeting, not a press release. A 51-year-old man alone with his parents' silverware. If this story is moving you, tell us in the comments. Should the pieces Hitler actually used have been kept, destroyed, or returned? We read every comment. And subscribe, because this kind of history needs to be told and remembered. Patton never wrote about Merkers in his published memoirs. He mentions it in passing, a single line about visiting the mine with Eisenhower and Bradley. Nothing about the silver, nothing about what he saw. But his private diary tells a different story. His entry for April 12, 1945, the day he descended into the mine, runs to almost 4 pages. It was declassified in 1974. Researchers at the Patton Museum in Fort Knox got access to it in the 1980s. The relevant passage reads as follows, and this is Patton's own voice, unfiltered. "We went down into the damned mine today with Ike and Brad. I have seen a great deal in this war and thought myself immune to surprise. I was wrong. The gold alone staggers the mind, but it is not the gold that will stay with me. It is the suitcases. Someone in that organization had the bureaucratic precision to label each one, to note its origin, as if theft at that scale required good record-keeping to justify itself. I stood in front of those suitcases and understood for the first time, not intellectually as I had known the facts before, but in my gut, in my bones, what we have been fighting. Not a country, not an ideology, a machine for the organized destruction of people's lives and belongings and identities. The silver I called ugly, and it was, because beauty made in the service of that machine becomes ugly by association. I do not know what should be done with all of it. That is above my pay grade. But I know it should not simply disappear into some vault and be forgotten. These things are proof. They should be kept as proof, for as long as humans exist and need reminding of what other humans are capable of." He wrote no more about it that night. You just heard Patton's private voice. Not the movie version, not the public general with the ivory-handled pistols and the slapping controversies. The private man, in his diary, trying to make sense of what he saw in that mine. Beauty made in the service of that machine becomes ugly by association. That line, that's why we tell these stories. Subscribe right now if you aren't already, and share this video with someone who thinks history is just dates and battles. It isn't. It's this. The full investigation of the Merkers mine took 3 years. Investigators eventually cataloged 8,307 individual artworks. Of those, 6,415 were returned to their original owners or the legal heirs of original owners. 1,892 could not be traced and were placed in German state museums with notations in every case that the ownership was disputed and subject to future claims. The gold, all 248 tons, was used to fund post-war reconstruction in the occupied countries from which it had been taken. It was distributed through the Inter-Allied Reparations Agency beginning in 1947. The currency from the 11 occupied nations was returned to those nations' central banks. The dental gold and personal effects from the camps were handled differently. They were transferred to the International Tracing Service, which spent decades, literally decades, trying to match belongings to victims and victims' families. As of 1970, 25 years after the war, the service had successfully matched and returned personal effects in 23,417 cases. The total number of items inventoried from the camps in the mine was approximately 400,000. The mathematics of that ratio, 23,417 returned out of 400,000, says something about scale that words struggle to capture. Hitler's personal silver, minus the pieces returned to Heinrich von Hausberg, was eventually transferred to the German federal government. The engraved pieces were kept in storage, neither displayed nor destroyed for decades. Where exactly they are today is, according to German archivists, not publicly disclosed. Which is to say, they exist somewhere, sitting in a vault, waiting for history to decide what to do with them. Private First Class Raymond Sears, the Alabama boy who watched the 3 generals step off the mine elevator in 1945, lived to 93 years old. He died in 2018. In 2005, a documentary filmmaker interviewed him for a project on the Monuments Men. She asked him what he remembered most from that day. He thought about it for a long time before he answered. "I remember General Patton picking up that silver fork," he said. "I was standing maybe 20 feet away. He picked it up, looked at the monogram, and then he made this face, like he smelled something bad, and then he put it down like it was nothing. I thought about that fork a lot over the years, about how that fork had been on Hitler's dinner table, and then it was in Patton's hand, and then it was back on the table in a salt mine in Germany." He paused. The whole war was kind of like that, wasn't it? Things passing from one hand to another. Countries, people, history. Everything moved. Everything changed hands. And what you did with what ended up in your hands, that was the whole story. He was quiet for a moment. Patton put the fork down. That was the right thing to do. What you did with what ended up in your hands, that was the whole story. Raymond Sears, 93 years old, got it exactly right. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been standing in that mine in 1945, if Patton had handed you that fork and asked what should be done with it, what would you have said? Put your answer in the comments right now. We read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, hit the bell, share this video. These are the stories that history books summarize in 3 sentences, and we refuse to let die. We'll see you in the next one.